In the middle of the 20th century, there were a number of French figures who straddled the line between science and philosophy, making important contributions to both domains. One of those people is the French biochemist Jacques Monod, who was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1965 for his research on how genes regulate cell metabolism. Now, he shared that Nobel Prize with another figure who also was quite influential in science, but also in philosophy. And that is the scientist Francois Jacob, who went on to write a book that was quite influential for a number of French philosophers, including Jacques Derrida, which is a book called The Logic of Life, which in short is a Foucauldian, loosely speaking Foucauldian approach to the history of biology, where Francois Jacob does to biology what Foucault tries to do to the history of our ways of knowing the world in the order of things, meaning that he looks back at how we have understood the living, how we have accounted for the properties of living beings and living systems from the 17th century, actually from the 16th century onward, beginning with the Renaissance. Now, these two figures, again, shared a Nobel Prize in 1965. And then a few years later, in 1970, Jacques Monod, the figure that I am making this video about, went on to publish a really interesting little book. In French, it's called Le hasard et la nécessité, which translates to chance and necessity. And this is a book where Monod promises to elucidate what he calls the strangeness of living beings. So he believes that, of course, the universe is populated by all kinds of things, right? There are comets, there are planets, there are stars, there are grains of sand, there are molecules, there are chairs, microphones, computers, so on and so forth. But among all the things that you can find in the universe, by far the strangest are living beings. And by that, he means, of course, human beings, but not exclusively. He means human beings, he means animals, he also means plants. Any organism that is alive is fundamentally strange. And that strangeness, according to Monod, requires accounting for. We need to tarry, or we need to be able to give an account of what it is that makes the living separate from the non-living. So he does draw a line in the universe, a kind of metaphysical line between the inanimate world and the animate world. Now, of course, we can problematize that distinction, and some people have, by pointing out that the difference between living and non-living is not as clear-cut as many of us imagine. Just think about viruses, for example. Are they alive? Are they not alive? It depends on how you define your terms, really. But in general, I think that this distinction between the living and the non-living realms does capture something that is intuitive about our experience of the world, and that from the point of the philosophy of biology is particularly important, because, of course, the living is the domain of biology. Biologos, the scientific study of life. And so biology is committed to the idea that there is a meaningful distinction, which is why biology is different, not only from physics, but also from chemistry. And so in this book, Chance and Necessity, Monod tries to make sense of this strangeness of living beings, that relative to things like grains of sand or mountains or rivers, we are a lot more complex, and that complexity needs to be philosophically and scientifically analyzed. And so Monod begins his account in Chance and Necessity by pointing out that what differentiates the living from the non-living, above all, is what he calls internal norms. Living organisms have certain processes that are normative, that are internal to them, that other entities that exist, that are inanimate, simply do not have. And so his approach from the very beginning is going to be internalist to some extent, in the sense that it's going to try to figure out what's happening within the boundaries, like within the skin or the outer structure, the outer membrane that delineates a living being. And he's going to approach that from a normative perspective, looking for the norms or principles that are guiding how that organism maintains itself. And the most important part of this book, which is what I want to highlight here, is that he develops a theory of the living that is rooted on three structural features that living beings possess and that, in fact, define what it means to be a living entity. Now, in reality, it's unclear whether there are three or two. Sometimes he vacillates between there are three criteria, there are two. In reality, the first two are interconnected, but I'm going to present them as three because he often does talk about these three separate terms as if they are independent of one another. So what separates the living from the non-living? Above all, the first thing is development. Of course, we know that organisms follow a developmental blueprint, right? So you have a fetus that grows, that is born, and then after birth continues on a particular process of maturation that is genetically determined. And so there is a logic of a temporal unfolding where there are phases that the organism has to go through in order to express its nature and be the kind of organism and entity that it is. Now, according to Monod, this kind of purposeful, goal-directed unfolding is what he calls teleonomy. It's a term that he introduces to make sense of the fact that there is this arc, of this developmental arc that allows us to mark a difference in the universe, to draw that metaphysical line between the living and the non-living, right? A mountain doesn't really evolve. It doesn't have a teleonomic structure in the same way that ants and bees and oak trees and human beings do. Now, it's really important to emphasize that although he uses the terms development and purpose, right, there's organisms are going somewhere. A baby cat is going to be an adult cat unless something happens. He is very clear that he does not mean by that anything mentalistic. So it's not as if the cat thinks, I'm going to become a mature cat. It's not as if the acorn thinks, I'm going to become a tree. It's not as if the seed thinks, I'm going to become a germinated plant. So there is here something like purpose, the teleonomic structure of organisms, that is just a constitutive feature of what it means to be a living entity. It's not in the mind of these organisms, it's just in their very structure. It is in their living processes. The second feature of the living relative to the inanimate is what Monod calls autonomous morphogenesis, which is a little bit of a mouthful, but let's break that down a little bit. So think about the term autonomous. It's about autonomy, autos, self, nomos, rule, or norm. So autonomy is about giving oneself the norm. I am an autonomous agent when I act according to the rules that I decide to abide by, right? So if as an adult, I decide to no longer drink alcohol, I express my autonomy by following the rule that I gave myself. Now, in the context of biology, when he's talking about autonomy, he means the self-regulation of the organism at a physiological and genetic level. And when he talks about morphogenesis, there is a similar relationship that we can highlight through the term. So autonomous, autonomos, self-ruling. Morphogenesis is morpho means form or shape, and genesis means generation or beginning. And so putting those two terms together, we get this theory of living beings as autonomously morphogenetic in the sense that they give themselves their own shape. They form themselves by following norms that are internal to them, rather than norms that are external to them, that belong to other organisms or to the environment. Now, the best way for me to visualize this is through an analogy to the world of art. Think about a sculpture, like a sculpture made of clay. a sculpture needs a certain shape or form, right? Like it needs to be given a morphose. But the way that we typically do that is externally. I, as a sculptor, give the shape that I want to the clump of clay. And in so doing, I create a sculpture. Now, imagine for a minute that you had a kind of magic clay that was both a sculpture and also the sculptor. In other words, a self-shaping clay, a clay that decided what forms it wanted to take at various moments in time. Once you imagine that, you're getting close to what Monod means by this notion of autonomous morphogenesis, where we all, the living, are kind of like that magic clump of clay that we give ourselves our shape, right? Like literally our morphology. Like I have 10 fingers, I have a head, I have 2 legs, I have a skin that covers the rest of my organs. And I do so developmentally by following internal norms that are genetically determined. And that includes the production, of course, of proteins and enzymes and things like that that give rise to who I am as an organism. Now, these first two concepts, the concept of teleonomy and autonomous morphogenesis, are closely related because, of course, when we're talking about that developmental trajectory of an organism, the way that trajectory is achieved is through an organism's autonomously morphogenetic self-determination. And so that's why those two can be collapsed into one. And in writing about this, it's really important to recognize that Monod is alluding or hinting or nodding at arguments that other philosophers have made about the essence of living beings. This is an argument that you find in the Critique of Judgment of Immanuel Kant, which is the idea that organisms build themselves, kind of like that magic piece of clay. We produce the materials of which we are made, right? So like my own body produces flesh, bone, hair, and at the same time, it gives itself form. Like we give ourselves our own form through this kind of like centripetal force where internally everything holds together by an internal logic. So that captures the first two features of living beings. The first one, again, is teleonomy. The second one is autonomous morphogenesis. I always struggle with that term. The third one is a lot simpler, and that is what Monod calls invariance. And that is that living beings, by definition, reproduce. They can reproduce asexually or sexually, but ultimately, there is a logic of repetition at the heart of the living process, where every organism, even if it fails, is in some way shaped and determined by this direction of ultimately leading to another member like it that is another token of the type, where the type is the species. So individuals produce other individuals that are true to type. And the important thing, again, is that all these three features of living beings, they belong to the living beings essentially, intrinsically. And of course, external factors can impede development. They can, maybe something happens to me that prevents me from growing into the mature version of myself. Maybe something prevents me from being reproductively successful. And so the external environment is important for Monod because it can impede all of these features, but it does not guide them. They are guided from within. Now, to put this text, Chance and Necessity, into perspective, I think it's really important to just note that Monod is a scientist first and foremost, and so he wants to move away from certain ways of thinking about the living and about nature that are at odds with the kind of mechanistic, deterministic, let's say deterministic, orientation of the modern scientific project. And that's why in this book, Monod is very clear that he is not a vitalist. He doesn't believe that living beings have like a mysterious force in them, like a metaphysical, spiritual principle of activity that makes them alive. There is no vital force, there is no élan vital that is in this text at all. Really, it's science all the way down with genes and proteins. And he says at one point, the problem with vitalism is that vitalism only makes sense as long as you are willing to live with unanswerable mysteries. And as a scientist, he doesn't really want that. He doesn't want metaphysical or extranatural principles in our accounts of the living world. Now, the second thing he says is, just as I am not a vitalist, I'm also not a dialectical materialist, which is a reference to Engels and a theory that he developed that seeks to bring together dialectics with materialism, basically arguing that the natural world works in the same way as human thinking. So, of course, if you are interested in dialectical philosophy dating back all the way to Hegel, with its subsequent reworking by Marx and Engels, Engels argues that human thinking functions as Hegel taught us by negation. So you have a thesis, antithesis, and then a kind of synthesis that then gets negated once again, and then you keep going in this constant process of negation and sublation. And according to Engels, that's how nature works. Nature produces something, then produces the negation of that something, and then produces the negation of the negation. Now, according to Monod, this way of thinking is highly anthropomorphic, because what we end up doing in dialectical materialism is we take the laws of human thinking and we just project them onto the external world as if the external world mirrored our internal thought process. And he thinks that that's a mistake. And so he wants to move away from vitalism and from dialectical materialism in order to open up this space where the universe is understood in terms of two poles. There is the pole, as the title indicates, of necessity. Genes necessitate, proteins necessitate, enzymes necessitate, and internal regulatory processes like the circulation of the blood, our reproductive cycle, so on. All of those things necessitate. They are lawful processes. And in fact, Monod says, the thing about living beings, the thing that makes them so strange to begin with, is that they follow many laws. They abide by all the laws of physics. There is no violation of physics in biology. But on top of that, they also follow their own biotonic laws, which are laws specific to the living realm. So in fact, biological systems are more lawful than physical systems because they abide by more laws. But the fact that there are laws, he says, should not make us overlook the fact that there is the pole of necessity and also the pole of chance. Chance is a concept that needs to be incorporated into our philosophy of biology and into our biological theories, because we know on scientific grounds that chance is an active player in two key areas of biology. One of them is the origin of life, that critical moment that we still can't really account for, when at some point in our evolutionary past, life entered the scene, right? We went from a world without living entities to the earliest, most rudimentary version of what life can mean, which then led to speciation and to the formation of species through natural selection. So at the origin of biology, understood here as the origin of life, we have chance. And then in the further reworking of that living, of that original living process, which is the process of evolution, you also have chance, because we know that evolution operates through chance mutations that are unpredictable and that you cannot account for in a mechanistic manner. You cannot predict what mutations are going to happen. So you have all the necessity of the living world that is still mediated or infused with a lot of randomness, with a lot of chance events that define what the living world is. And so Monod ends this book by encouraging us to think of life as precisely that axis. Life is the axis that has those two poles on each end. Necessity and chance. In French, le hasard et la nécessité.